Hello everyone, today we talk about Reconquista warfare, always a good topic to spend more than a couple of words on. Over the years I've made some fairly in-depth videos on Iberian warfare during the Middle Ages, but compared to other parts of Europe, admittedly, we left even the greater depths out. This video is going to be, if anything, an overview of some specifically anthropological, knightly, military aspects of the Reconquista from the 10th century. We'll talk also about the Visigoths, as a matter of fact. In fact, we need to bridge, to amalgamate a bit these scattered videos that we've made, emphasizing the military, the chivalric, equestrian, knightly dimension of this system that is different from the rest of Western Europe. Of course, every country has its own peculiarity, and generally speaking, you can and you should always even compare the most similar ones to realize in how many important things they actually differed. But when we talk about the Iberian Peninsula as a whole, this is more than a simple country. In fact, still today, it's not a single country. Unfortunately for the Spanish, at least attempted that many times. We made multiple videos about that, also how Portugal, from a modest county, basically fought its way through, withstanding the might of the Castilian-Leonese power, etc. So, Iberian military history is actually very rich. It's also actually very austere, stern. Like I would say that the Black Legion sown on the Spaniards is not really capturing the depths of their culture and their vividly, in fact, if you look at the Spanish world is, of course, also at some point closer to other parts of Europe. This is especially true for Navarre, for Catalonia. When you look at a spirit like the one of Portugal, you really realize, even in the art, in the architecture, it is somehow different. Even the Iberian Gothic, Portuguese Gothic in particular, is different from the other Western European ones, right? Style. It's as if it had gradually been polished, smoothened by the Atlantic currents, and it tells a history of great pain, of great suffering. That, of course, has its roots in the Reconquista and in the incredibly brutal, and in this sense somehow historiographical forgotten violence and horror at some point of the Reconquistas, or at least the broader war between the Christians and the Muslims. Also, once among Christians and among Muslims, El Cid sort of teaches in that way. But in a broader sort of cultural sense, what we are told by the 1970s and 1980s professors that remained eventually in the university, etc., it's mostly like, but you should highlight how these cultures met and how everything was prosper and advanced, especially from the Islamic side, of course. And we should celebrate the multicultural exchanges and look at the Mediterranean. We're so open, and all these cultures and ideas. This is not to say that, of course, there isn't a marvel to behold in all these cultures and civilizations. But aside from preferences, I would say that history is a pretty tough and hard lesson to learn, right? And the broader picture of the Reconquista should, of course, be studied also for the exchanges among these cultures. We made ourselves videos about, for example, the Mudeyars, that are essentially the Muslims, the Jews, and their militias, specifically in the Christian armies of the Reconquista that especially posed themselves, especially in Castilla, after the conquest of Toledo, so the cornerstone of the entire peninsula, so to say, in its enormous complexity, the protectors, not just of the Christians, but of the Muslims and the Jews, that at that point were impossible to do without in terms of political and strategic force. At some point, these same communities had sabotage the broader Islamic effort. This was true even, when you look at the Islamic conquest of Visigothic Spain, what did go wrong there as well. So it's actually a very long history, one of essentially more than 700 years of Islamic presence, in the sense of general and irreconcilable fracture, right, of the Iberian Peninsula that in great part does pass through warfare, right? Spain was historically a prosper province. It was admittedly, again, quite different within itself since antiquity, but essentially the most Romanized parts in the south, but also following the Mediterranean coast, were historically, the product in great part of Romanization of the previous Celto-Iberian culture that had been a somehow orderly development. Now, I will not digress on how things changed, and they changed in part because of the fact that there was not like a collapse of some essentially major power concentration in the hands of privates that essentially prevented the Visigothic monarchy to fully consolidate a stable power that could come out in different ways, but that, if anything, are ways that are witnessed only by very few peoples in the period. We also witness indeed the Islamic conquest as not really a great moment of reorganization, right? There was partially some of that, especially in the south, that had maintained mostly its Romano-Byzantine legacy. There was, however, in the process of the conquest, the shattering of the Visigothic kingdom was gradually trying to sort of bolster its institutional solidity in its own ways, of course, an overthrowing, a collapse, and that, civilizationally speaking, is not a good thing. When you look at Muslim or Christian Spain, especially during the High Middle Ages, you can't help but notice that even the Muslim part was the more advanced, and remember, it was more advanced on top, like mostly Islamic rules were, on top of regional cultures, right? Much of for example, the fighting alla Jineta is almost ubiquitously attributed to Islamic influence, was something that, as you very well know, existed. It was basically the hallmark of also ancient Celtiberian warfare. And in general, the prosperity of the Islamic Al-Andalus that we also described in terms of military organization, indeed, there was, especially in the High Middle Ages, a great continuity of the statal effectiveness of a centralized system, like a permanent army of some sort, naturally by the time's standards. But it was a power to be reckoned with, was at some point in a strong sort of dialogue with the Ottonian Empire. At a point it had sort of various some states and or proxy states scattered across, for example, so the central Mediterranean. Think about the provincial base of Fraxinetum, from which the Saracens had come to raid up to the Rhineland. And yet, as with the broader so-called Islamic Golden Age, that has been somehow overly stated in some aspects, right? From the other side, people, touch on the other extreme by saying, no, it sacked, etc. In some ways, it's as if you had to compare, the Byzantines with the Franks. But we've seen it far and wide that the Latin Germanic civilization at large was overwhelmingly successful, and even over these other ones, and that even in the Iberian case, with greater difficulties from the more primitive and less developed north. In fact, the Westerners had the capacity, the valor of turning the tides, strategically wise, in the Iberian Peninsula, and to eventually gain the upper hand on the south. This passed through centuries of relentless warfare in some areas that at some point became a desert and or were basically turning to pastoralism from a past of agriculturalism, like the latifundia in Roman times, simply because the relentless hit-and-run warfare, both at a strategic and a tactical level, basically rendered large swathes of the same Iberian Plateau too unstable for anything sort of too permanent in terms of political, infrastructural, and social development. And we know what kind of a mess actually Andalusia turned to be historically after Las Navas. The fact that the Christians, yes, crushed basically the greatest force of the Almohads, that was properly calling on a caliphal legacy, and jihad. Also made a video about its intertwinement with North Africa, and in many ways was universally hegemonized by the Almohads in many ways that are reflected in the political and institutional legacy of the local powers. There was indeed, like, again, the coming backs with the Marinids at some point. Morocco attempted also up to the mid-14th century with some sort of general threats even later to reinvade the peninsula. Naturally, in a very changed situation. I mean, gaining the upper hand was sort of very, fantasy-like. If anything, it was about gaining the upper hand on the Straits because the south was yet to be fundamentally formed and forged. Like, it's something similar to what happens to France. It wasn't for the fact that the Carpathians, in taking over Occitania, took over a more fragmented system that hadn't quite developed towards, for example, a more statal direction, like, I don't know, even the Italian communes had done, even the Kingdom of Germany in its hyper sort of seigneurialization at the local level did go on as a world country, as a world nation, even in the later Middle Ages. With Spain, things were definitely a bit more complicated. Complicated, of course, by the Muslim past of these areas that, again, lasted for more than half of a millennium, at least especially the Al-Andalus, that still was some kind of foreign country, had sort of destroyed that Muslim state, but taking over in a direct fashion those areas, and doing so while you had other Iberian competitors at that point basically turn against one another in the process, both in this effort towards the south and literally in a more longitudinal fashion, messed up things further. You know that basically even the marriage of the Reyes Católicos at the end of the Middle Ages, that is such a big deal for Spanish history, and the general power of the Spanish Empire in Europe as across the globe during the Renaissance, still it's not the product of a full sort of unification of the system. Like the crowns, for example, of Castile and Aragon remained formally separated. Also, other possessions that the Spaniards had across different seas were in many ways some sort of shared, even with other, in fact, oligarchic private powers. Think about in southern Italy, the difficulties in other theaters like Flanders that we discussed recently, by the way, we'll make more videos on. I also made a video about the late medieval Spanish and Portuguese army organizations that shows you how by the mid-14th century, both the English and the French, regardless of the troubles that especially the latter had during the 100 Years' War, in the moment in which this was brought also in the Iberian Peninsula, met with, had fundamentally been backwards to Western military developments. The concept of the men-at-arms, of the indenture, of this more professionalized uniform retinues was somehow much more heterogeneous and deficitary in Spain. There were less soundly permanent institutions. There had been a level of sort of general decay and of chronic instability that, even though had not prevented the development of such powerful kingdoms like the ones of Castile, still took a while to take off according to, say, the patterns of France, of Italy, especially from a political and military point of view. And so there is and this is interesting also because it turns out, as we've seen, especially in the regional warfare series, that Spain, in around like the 10th, 11th, still the 12th century, had an incredibly advanced military technology. Right, there are things we find in Spain archaeologically, iconographically, and in literary description that at some point would not appear but in the later Middle Ages. Of course, these are designs. We often can't properly even understand whether how they function nor how spread they actually were. But that's something I already discussed elsewhere. And yet, in parallel to the change of tides, let's say the turning of tides, during the Reconquista, realized that even though the Christian effort was more functional and more successful than the Muslim one, something had been burned, something had been destroyed in between, and this had brought to a general civilizational instability. You can argue the Iberian Peninsula is also a relatively closed world. Right, the Catalans are very enterprising. They, they compete with the Italians. We have made videos about the Catalan Grand Company of Roger de Flor, their Greek and Anatolian adventures. However, the rest of Spain is fundamentally continental. Right, in the south, yes, there are eventually centers like Seville that becomes the true port of the Castilian kingdom. Portugal, of course, also for some geographical reasons that are self-evident, was the first one to open a bit to oceanic navigation, the age of explorations, with Italian cruise ships, etc. This was true also for the English or the French when they had to, especially the latter, to go at war at sea in some ways. A continental power that definitely remains, in this sense, closed to an extent within itself, and less spoiled by some external influences, more than we think. Really. There is a broader sense, for example, of more totalizing sense of religious struggle, with characters of sacrifice, as we were saying before, also probably bloodiness, austerity, and heaviness that remains also in the later, for example, Iberian Baroque. In the Renaissance, and it's something which can't be explained, if not properly, by a native in its deeper feelings. Right? Admittedly, guys, of course, this native is historically versed enough because it's really difficult to fully picture this, and I'm trying my best in this series to really compose it in its complexity, because this is also a bit like the paradox that this system is huge. Right, and incredibly different within itself. There are landscapes, tongues, general forms of social-cultural agglutination that can be very different. There is the very strong Mudéjar minority that in some places like Valencia can reach up to 40% of the entire population. Right, it was a real Manzoni made one. Video about it, of course, and again, also a bit the overall fragmentation, but alongside a feudal pattern that, in fact, in and of itself is not immediately is not really suggesting this explosion, for example, of later technological development. Spain was not even dramatically populated, but it was highly militarized historically in ways that other countries in Europe weren't. And this is arguably at the root also the later success during the Renaissance, the one of the tercios, and the fact that, say, the Spanish gentry, the hidalgos, apparently had an enormous spread, also because they were actually a bit poor, and facilitating eventually the integration in pike and shot warfare, which becomes, for example, a hallmark of the entire Habsburgic imperial tradition, right? Also in Germany, or in Italy, the Catholic effort of the early modern wars was carried out by, for example, a practice of even noblemen starting as a common pikeman, because back in the day, actually, also in that day, the tercia was setting the standard of that kind of new type of warfare. It had truly been influenced by the struggle against the Moors. If you're interested, I also made a bit about North African warfare across the Middle Ages, the early modern age, and we'll come back on that topic. So I made substantial numbers of videos on Iberian warfare, but I would like to really expand it very much because we haven't, it feels like we haven't really covered it takes forever just to create a narrative. It's difficult to create a narrative for this war. Medieval Iberia here, just 62 videos, and it feels like I haven't even begun to scratch the surface, right? So we'll have to make at least double to claim we have accomplished something barely satisfactory as a starter for Schwerpunkt. Today, however, as I was premising before, we will look at some more knightly and generally military aspects of the picture, especially throughout the High Middle Ages that we were also mentioning as a bit like this turning point in the high point at the same time, in fact, of the Reconquista in terms of struggle, of warfare, and its full characterization, also a bit the times in which this, from the sources, starts being more concretely documentable. So the 10th century, right? The 10th century can be considered in some ways the outset of the Reconquista, as probably the Christian powers in the north start being competitive enough with the Muslims not to remain merely concentrated, in fact, in their narrow territorial dimension, was also the one of the mountains, the ones of scarce economical potential. Some people essentially stress, well, basically the Visigothic refugees had taken refuge in the north, but always remember that the north had always been fighting against the Visigoths as well. And even though, of course, they had understood the apocalyptic dimension of the Islamic invasion per se, and created some greater ideological glue around the Christian struggle, not much the Visigothic legacy, right? But the Christian struggle, that was what really mattered. And again, it made a lot of sense considering the sort of the flattening of the whole picture, like the humbling of the same Visigothic tradition. Surely lived in the northern part, but was really re-engineered. Re-engineered, in fact, together with the entirety of the Iberian Christian society, as structure around perpetually engaged in warfare, right? The 10th century is called the Iron Century, and admittedly, warfare was pretty much perpetual all across the world. However, the northern Iberian Christian society was much more geared up for some, not necessarily more advanced, again, military capacity or whatever, but a relentless one that derived from the general desperation of being from the weaker side of a strategical isle, at least up to that point, and having essentially specialized in or developed further, because this had been the strategic norm since antiquity, to launch raids, very often in depth, of the Islamic territory. That at this point was leaving a pretty difficult time. If you're interested, I made some videos properly about the Caliphate of Cordoba itself, and if anything, we have to talk even more about that topic. An Islamic world that had been somehow feudalizing, naturally not in the ways that the Frankish world was historically witnessing. As we explained before, the Cordoban world was much less privatized and decentralized than the Latin Germanic world. Admittedly, it was also not as thriving as certain parts of the West. For example, northern France wasn't faring that badly in terms of sort of overall still functional monarchical recognition and management of an incredibly large amount of resources. Also, northern Italy was quite advanced. I made a video comparing, by the way, Catalonia, that was a bit sheltered in all of this, and as you know, part of the Western Frankish kingdom, with Lombardy, exactly during the 10th century. So if you're interested a bit in this comparison, you can look at that. The Ebro Valley had always been very Romanized, and paradoxically, not per se anti-Visigothic, but say, generally speaking, not very in line with the policy of Toledo. It's a bit like along the pattern of the contrast between the broader Germanic Castile and Catalan autonomism. However, since, and this is the paradox, since the Muslims had taken over the entirety of the peninsula, including Catalonia at different points, there was a bit of back and forth. That last margin of the Catalan area that sort of had remained more or less more autonomous than the other, together with the northern part of the peninsula, and it was, however, more advanced, more urbanized, more interconnected. It was known as Gothia, right? Especially in Gaul, right? In what was called Septimania/Gothia. Benedict of Aniane came from, for example, here, the second Saint Benedict that essentially reformed Carolingian monasticism under Louis the Pius. So we're talking really a very complex picture where, as you know, the Franks had historically infiltrated the north here because they had always had the upper hand, both under both at the times of the Visigoths and at the time of the Arabs. Every once in a while, it didn't always end well. Look at Roland at Roncesvalles. But in general, the capacity of the Franks to project their power to northern Spain was greater, and greatly helping in informing an actual Christian development there than anything the Muslims of Cordoba could really do that far north. Right? There were at some times massive expeditions. Think about one of Almanzor to even Santiago of Compostela. That was truly already the most important Christian shrine in the peninsula. There was, again, a very intense struggle of faith in this, and one that everybody had to navigate, given that the Muslims had conquered a Christian land after all, right? And as you know, it's not like the Muslims took over Christian lands and Christianity disappeared. We've seen it also for the lands lost in Asia by the Byzantines. Claudio Sánchez-Albornoz is recognized for, among other achievements, proving, both definitely and within the anti-Brunner controversy, this is a modern scholar, the critical role of cavalry and horse-mounted archers, right? As a military force in Visigothic Spain, we're also establishing that the Islamic invasion brought negligible innovations in this area in particular. And there is a text, which is the Recapitulatio in Laude Gothorum by Isidore of Sevilla himself, that is basically the conclusive, summarizing part of the Historia Gothorum section that praises the Goths and their achievement. And there, Isidore of Sevilla, we're talking the early 7th century. So as you know, Isidore of Sevilla was also to become in the greatest encyclopedist in medieval literature, in medieval war. Here he praised the Goths for their ancestry, for their connection with the Scythians, with other steppes peoples. So there is a very interesting sort of also biblical framing. The general knowledge, of course, of Isidore was truly encyclopedical, and he expresses somehow the obvious, what was recognized also by the Franks later on, even after the Goths had been taken over by the Muslims, and some of them had, as we've seen, also remained as client states in northern Spain, not much as Goths, but still with that legacy, and reinvigorating their equestrian culture as raiders in the north. In fact, as excellent riders as well. So provided with a great military tradition that historically was, in fact, among the Germanic peoples, the most cavalry-based, right, in Central Eastern Europe, for many reasons. This was attributed actually to the same Longobards that never really went over to Eastern Europe, that had also integrated a consistent part of Scythian elements. People, generally speaking, think that the migration here was just a major, melting pot of some sort from an ethnic point of view. Actually, research today shows that we don't have to be so sure about that. But there is no doubt that, especially in military techniques, in the general influx in bellic matters, indeed, peoples like the Goths had brought to Spain. It was also settled by the Alans at some point, and had witnessed the Vandals. There were other groups like the Suebi in what is essentially today's northern Spain, Galicia essentially, and northern Portugal, etc., with and also, with different backgrounds. Some were fully fledged Iranians, others were, even Celto-Slavo-Germanic peoples of sort like the Vandals, for example. But indeed, like bringing that sense of proto-feudal mentality associated with a reinvigoration of warriorism, the gradual sort of erosion of public structures because of the general battering that these Western provinces underwent in the process. Even though, again, Gaul and Spain did not witness the end of the Roman latifundium, at least in any violent, traumatic fashion. It mostly flowed into what could be an early medieval courtly seigneurial, again, proto-feudal system of sort. Reason for which, surely Visigothic Spain, such as, for example, some Merovingian Gaul, retained a remarkably consistent equestrian military culture. We should differentiate, obviously, always between the sort of individualistic warriorism that could be proper of, especially like tribal confederacies, like that were already stepping up compared to their past, right, and to at the times of Tacitus, so to say. In terms of collective training, etc., these were pretty good horsemen. If you read this strategic and you get adjusted that, even though it is explained that they didn't really have many cohesive political structures that could confer that level of broader collective training that you would see only, in fact, in Merovingian Gaul, that developed also in a more orderly and continuative way. Because, in fact, Spain is taken over by the Arabs that had, again, a more centralizing system, more stable one, more settlistic one, and not necessarily a more civilized one, we must think. Many people always like to imagine that, again, the Germans were these destroyers of civilization, that they established, they went back to tribal, primitive, traditional, like it. This is not really how things really work. You can be as traditional, and you will be actually even more traditional the more powerful you actually are, the more force you're able to wield at a larger scale. And this is, in fact, what you should actually praise the Latin Germanic world that is always considered sort of weaker and somehow inferior to, the Arabs or the Byzantines in the early Middle Ages, I think on Schwerpunkt I've made enough videos on this subject. If you really look at the depths of it, does not seem to have ever been a thing by any broader indicator, right? And if anything, also through Spain, we must come back to that topic, because this is also, as we explained at the beginning, one of the most tormented lands, one of those that would really signify on the longer run the effort to reject, actually, and to successfully overthrow that Islamic model over time. And let's say we can say that by the 12th to 13th century, if not even before, even the 10th, as we were explaining here, the Christian North, through also a lot of further sort of post-Carolingian influxes. There is no doubt that the vassalic beneficiary system, but the Western way over at this point is informing also northern Spain. It had been part in different zones of the Carolingian Empire itself back in the day. Will really manage to prevail over the Arabs, that we call Arabs, by the way, but weren't technically even Arabs in a broader sense. Yes, we say Arabs because, again, it's just like North Africa today. They have nothing to do with Arabs in an ethnic sense, but they of course speak Arab. They are, in that sense, Arab in as much as they are Muslim, right? But when you look at, for example, the Arab elites that eventually became Arabized elites in a cultural sense, that conquered across the Gibraltar Strait in 711, you realize that they were, first of all, largely North Africans, right? They were Berbers. Most troops were not even horsemen, as a matter of fact. The Carol Fire, all those tactics, the Arabs used that. Most Berbers there were infantrymen, right? Not of the Mauryan skirmishing kind, etc. There was that too, in part, because as infantrymen, they had sort of these lighter skirmishers around. Cavalry was weaker, right? But in a sense, Spain as a whole was becoming Gothic Spain, if this hadn't been cut short as such, was actually a more similar thing to, again, Merovingian, now almost Carolingian Gaul, in terms of private retinues, etc. Exactly because that Roman legacy, the latifundian system, doesn't matter how, again, degraded, privatized, etc., also in a relatively, statally dysfunctional way, right, was developing important military clienteles, mostly mounted. There are many reasons why these forces were mounted in that way, but there is definitely an elite, right? There is a social cream that has the rest of the population to work in the field for maintaining them and waging war, again, in this disorderly picture, because the monarchy had essentially been defeated in Spain, all right? The Franks, for example, split at some point in 4 different chunks, but they had so much deeply ingrained since Clovis the sacrality of the dynasty that they wouldn't actually essentially depart from that. The Longobards in Italy, also during the Carolingian time, so much so that Charlemagne adopted the title himself of King of the Longobards, differently from any other people that he conquered, had developed a radically advanced, civilized kingdom, by far the most advanced in Western Europe in strictly institutional juridical terms, well urbanized, tidy, etc. In fact, not as feudal as basically these other ones, exactly because in Italy the latifundium had been severely unhinged. The same can be said for Anglo-Saxon Britain, that, however, was also, as doesn't matter how slowly, but still gradually compacting towards a more unitary physiognomy that was, if anything, always recognized by the Anglo-Saxons, who had immediately set themselves apart from the inhabitants of the British islands as soon as they had, in fact, set foot in there. Spain was a sort of monster with many heads. Like, there was so many provinces on their own, a weak monarchy, some increasingly sort of increasingly effective to a degree attempts to co-opt part of this nobility with titles that resemble some broader feudal ones. But the system was so much the product of a monarchy that shrank in control just a few tenths of miles around Toledo, and being tyrannized by the Hispano-Visigothic nobility, lay and ecclesiastical alike, as it was proven in the accounts of the ecclesiastical and to some extent ambitionally ecumenic councils of Toledo did not even recognize Rome and were trying to imitate Constantinople, but still on their own. That system collapsed, right? The Jews simply passed from the Arab side in the moment the Muslims invaded the land, because the Visigoths had by far the harshest legislation against the Jews in the entire Germanic tradition. Essentially, you know how things went. The Guadalete, the entire sort of military path, the Visigothic kingdom was basically crumbled, a bit like, I don't know, the Vandals or the Ostrogoths had crumbled under Belisarius. And even at the time, as you know, the Byzantines had actually set foot in had seized control of southern Spain. It only from a few generations had been taken over by the Visigoths. There is a great deal late antique continuity if you realize that Byzantine sort of territory did not completely overlap with the Arab one, because the Arabs managed eventually to expand it across the entire peninsula, but fundamentally was the south, right? The urbanized, the incredibly developed, rich, fertile south. Baetica, historically one of the most radically Romanized provinces. In the west, again, one of the most advanced. Isidore of Seville was just also an example of that cultural legacy. And so, also talking about that fall is quite complicated. Never really made a video about, if anything, the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, but we will definitely get there. Part of the aforementioned debate between Sánchez-Albornoz after Brunner, if anything, derived from the fact that the Iberian society was conceived in some less Germanic sense in terms of legacy and feudal structures and honor and etc. by an older historiography. Isidore of Seville is quite open in telling us how sort of equestrian the late Visigothic society, not even that late, telling the truth, already was, in fact, and it had always been to a degree. We also realize, and we've seen this in our videos, for example, about the 11th century Spanish heavy infantrymen, that indeed the north was a bit different, right? There was indeed over there an aristocracy, sort of large land estate owners that could afford, of course, heavy cavalry, etc. But this was a more primitive land. There was less surplus. There are more mountains around. The terrain is tougher. And so there is also a lot of foot, or if you want, dismounted warfare, because there is no doubt that this is largely an aristocratic society, like all the early medieval ones at the end of the day, regardless of the social stratification. And again, yes, northern Spain was less socially stratified than other parts of the peninsula, but in general, right, that's what the system was based on already. But in fact, less resources for larger amounts of heavy cavalry, which partially explains, as it had been, I don't know, for the case for the Cantabrians back in the day in the same exact region, that typical fighting a la Gineta, hit-and-run tactics, incredibly mobile warfare, one of essentially light horsemen/skirmishers that had to cope with the Cordovan armies that were pretty tough, always provided that we're technically talking about Spaniards themselves, including Christians that were surely sent as militias to fight against the Christians in the north themselves. And that therefore could not quite simply, they were really the greatest strategic force, right, and had greater difficulties, however, to fight up north across, several hundred kilometers, if not more, with the connections of the time. Imagine all the strategic difficulties of fighting in the mountains, the logistics of literally fighting all across Iberian time, like, the 10th century. So even though at some point the Muslims actually succeed in subjugating, rendering tributary the entirety of the north, they never succeed in directly controlling it. Yes, there are military colonies. We've seen it also in the video about before Navarre, right? In Pamplona we find Islamic cemeteries, right, with Arabized names, etc. So it's a very complicated picture, where we realize that there is a very high blend of identity, of allegiance, and so that sort of what, again, the leftist leaning would call like multicultural picture is definitely present. But it's also present in as much as the Islamic power is shaded and quite decentralized in the north. In fact, it looks more like some proto-feudal system. And generally speaking, it's not like that from Cordoba they could control, the emirs of Zaragoza, for example. And again, the Iberian Peninsula is freaking huge. I always say this. Like, if you, France is bigger than Spain as a broader landmass, but Spain plus Portugal are bigger than France. So it's something insanely vast and also relatively wild. Because again, civilization is mostly in the south, in the southeast, the northeast, along the coast, if anything. On the Atlantic, there isn't really much. Especially in the north, there isn't really much. And in between, it's a very tough terrain that everybody who has traveled across Spain sees, right? This desolated plains dominated by fortified, today not, but at the time, of course, still, with the cities, with the medieval towns, there still exist fortified hilltops that would have been so from the times of the Celtic barons or even before. Some semi-arid landscape, in many cases in between these areas. And so it's a terrifying place to actually fight, right? The southern European theaters of war are one worse than the other. So speaking of the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian one, or the Balkan one, you really don't know which one is worse and more terrifying to fight. And this is also great stuff breeds. Again, it's difficult, especially in a video like this, to summarize topics of this caliber, but it is believed by some scholars that the Goths, who had retreated after the Islamic invasion and conquest at the end of the day, as the Goths had been defeated, what remained of them, to the rugged northern mountains of the Iberian Peninsula, where they would have maintained the legacy of their equestrian tradition, despite, again, the terrain of their strongholds being particularly unsuitable for its practice. If anything, again, most of the Gothic wealth had been taken over by the Muslims, and it's not like the Visigoths could fully replicate their own military system or culture in the north. It had always historically been incredibly violently adverse to any attempt of domination from the south, right? You know, there is a very strong Celtic identity in the north, one that had brought also during the Roman domination to a very scarce level of development and Romanization itself, a bit like Armoric, etc. In fact, these lines had been a veritable pain in the behind for the Visigothic kings. They had to create military colonies to stem these raiders. They had to come as close to check them in the valleys. This is, by the way, exactly what the Arabs will do also on the pathway that the Visigoths had created in terms of settlements, of fortified emplacements. By the way, one of this, and I always remember this, I should do it, one of the most underrated aspects of early medieval warfare is the level of encapsulation already existing before, and especially connected even with the late Roman fortifications. We will see this at some point. Say to the point, I don't know, that the Arabs exploited against the Franks some fortifications that the Hispano-Romans had used against the Goths back in the day, or stuff like that, right? Very few centuries away, well, at this point, starting to be really a half of a millennium, but say society had not had this enormous potential to evolve in different ways, so it's more or less the same thing. If anything, most of those infrastructures had gone ruined, but they had not disappeared. They had still been useful and, in fact, exploited. Now, within the 10th century Asturian-Leonese kingdom that I made a video about, by the way, a clear distinction existed between knights and infantry. This is obvious. Also in the Vandal era Sweden, there was indeed a centrality of the knight, right? You cannot deny that the entirety of these cultures, the Arab ones included, consider their heroes as elite cavalrymen, right? Naturally, the difference is anthropological and social, either than strictly technical or ideal, right? It's reflected in the terms that, again, in a world like 10th century northern Iberia, only very affluent people could afford to fight on horseback, especially with a heavy panoply. While the infantry was sort of the basic, like rough mountaineers, normally, at each other's throats for cattle raiding and habitual assaults, infiltration in neighboring valleys, etc., were just up for a fight to begin with. Again, their material culture was traumatically primitive. I cannot stress enough how. But this made them very good fighters, if anything, because they were so hungry and desperate to a degree, especially under Islamic pressure, that having nothing to lose, like they became terrifying foes. But again, there is always a cooperation between the two arms. There is not a space politically or socially where the cavalry is somewhere and the infantry another, reflecting the coexistence and specialized roles of two quite well-combined methods of arming and engaging in combat. Admittedly, I made a video, for example, about the Visigothic horse of the migration era, together with basically any other, including some reference to the Arabs, and in fact, this early Reconquista Iberian context in particular, showing you how still even the most advanced heavy cavalry in Western Europe was often still dismounting to fight. Well, in the northern Iberian context, this was even more pronounced in many ways. That's what I explained in that military historical unit video I was talking about before. This differentiation, of course, persisted thanks to the limitations of terrain, even as the practice of, for example, universal levies remained in use. Heavy cavalry was always followed by consistent amount of infantry. These were the subjects of the local aristocrats that owed them protection and worked for them, also to provide those very means that rendered mounted combat so specialized and effective. And there is no doubt that, especially through the influences of the rest of Western Europe and the general development of the times, and also the actual success of the early success of the Reconquista, the system was obviously as gradually transitioning from a strictly military function to a fiscal one, meaning that conquering more valleys, more inhabited areas, more advanced communities, etc. This is mostly what the Christians do. They arrive eventually to Toledo. This is the apotheosis, aside from Cordoba, of that. They, even as conquerors of these new communities that had been also from the other side up to that point, they preferred to specialize themselves into that kind of warfare, of mounted warfare, by exploiting the resources provided by the local communities, mostly as subjects, as agriculturists. Again, militias in Spain are always important. Infantry forces are in Spain relatively underestimated. They're nothing like, again, you could see they're similar to Occitania in a sense in terms of military effectiveness. Not quite, again, the incredibly advanced ones of central northern Italy, or at some point even some more courageous ones, in like the ones of Flanders by Iberian standards. We are looking at some general, especially urban participation, because again the Arabs had relied on those urban dwellers that were normally, again, they had their own, they would maintain their own urban knights. This is absolutely the case for any place in Europe, by the way, that with cities, etc. However, these countries were to mostly develop along the pattern of a feudal system, right, with enormous amounts of land controlled by very few, and in fact, in that sense, very knightly specialized families that controlled a bit the establishment as a whole. There are, however, some broader interconnections also with the rest of Europe. In fact, a pivotal shift had occurred when, as had happened in Gaul in the latter half of the 8th century with the Carolingians, the demand for knights became critical, right, relegating infantry to a gradually minor role. This is part of a broader societal exhaustion, which, by the way, in those centuries would have been caused by the same Islamic conquest that in part had produced a bit the same. Like when you look at the Reconquista, you realize that the northern Christian powers succeed in as much as the population from the other side opens the gate to them, because they didn't want to fight, right, for not much for the Arabs. At some point, some of their leaders sided with, with the Christian effort in order that they became subjects of the same, and they continued existing as Muslim rulers in essentially now a Christian reconquered context, in fact, typical of the Reconquista. And there's a lot of ambiguity for a long time, also regarding religion in that regard. More of this in some broader fate and social terms in another video, but the same Islamic conquest at some point had essentially been rendered possible by the same sort of elite orientations that the same Visigothic establishment had taken, alienating some important parts, as we've seen. For example, the Jewish community was very consistent, especially in southeastern Spain. It's also some of the most important coastal areas, etc. the interland was poorer, right? So you have to understand this also in socio-economical terms. They had preferred to side with the greater power that promised some sort of more functional, concentrated force and subtle development in connecting their markets to a circuit that reached as far as Southeast Asia at a point. So that's how Muslim Spain in many ways had been created. But as the Asturian-Leonese initiated their offensive against the Muslims, the theater of war moved, as we explained, from the northern mountains and fortresses where infantry had been effective to the expansive arid meseta. In these vast, desolate plains that you can picture, there are some beautiful images I posted from those castles, like in the midst of this landscape, far moved from, in fact, their northern bases. The Christians recognized that warfare in such regions required some greater military development. Some historians do not understand that they confuse the tactical level with the strategical one, right? And in this sense, the technical also with the broader political. Meaning, again, there was some greater reliance on hit-and-run skirmishers in a constitutively proportional tactical sense when these forces were in the north, right? The notion that more cavalry was needed just because there were open plains, and that this would have developed in particular the skirmishing kind of warfare in Spain is incorrect, right? That had always existed. Lack of larger numbers, at least of heavier cavalry, because both the Christians and the Muslims already had that, was mostly a matter of societal constitution, right? Again, the North had few surplus. The Arabs had a less feudal system. So this is the reason why actually cavalry, also especially from the Arab side, and in part also from the Christian one for a while, would always contain this more skirmishing aspect, right? It's not like, I don't know, there are plains like, I don't know, in northern France or in southern England or in northern Italy or in the Low Countries, and then you have greater, let's say, need for if anything, skirmishers, or a particularly non-straightforward heavy cavalry tactic. That depends largely on your societal proportion. Again, countries in Western Europe like England, France, Italy, etc., had mostly developed along the pattern of some more straightforwardly subtle direction in one another, greater cooperation between lay and ecclesiastical powers with an enormous continuity from Roman times, without any major fracture caused by external cultures like the Muslim ones. Hence, their armies were sort of more orderly. Per capita wealth was substantially high. Say the greater monarchies could afford large numbers of really very heavy cavalry. Some of these guys were going to fight, as you know, in the Reconquista as crusaders, both as, say, again, heavy knights or as crossbowmen, as marines. This is in part like how complex the system was becoming. The Westerns have heavy cavalry and heavy infantry. The Spaniards are basically developing along the same patterns, except they have always this slightly this slight element of lighter force in their troops, right? Their cavalry, as we've seen also in the video about the medieval Spanish and Portuguese organization, at times was less, for example, even, say, less organizedly and consistently produced. Like, sometimes it seems even very important people went to war on donkey back, not on horseback, because that cost much for the breeding structures and political stability of the Iberian Peninsula was paradoxically not so straightforwardly available. By the way, the Christian knights of Iberia had very good horses, right? It's the myth that Christian knights, being heavier in the Reconquista or in the Crusades, could not compete with the lighter Islamic cavalries is complete BS, right? We have large evidence of the fact that heavier knights could chase, of course, lighter troops, especially when a broader formation is broken. You can't cut down them with grass, but I don't know. Also, the Numidians, that were peoples fighting almost entirely with mounted skirmishers and were quite prized for their cavalry skills, hired Celtiberian knights as bodyguards, and we know that these could and would reach, as we explained in our videos about ancient Iberian warfare, the lighter North African skirmishers. What the difference that here is made, the reason why you change type of combat is not much the type of terrain per se, because it's also ridiculous to presume that, I don't know, there is a place that is just the mountain, right? Those things do matter, but again, if from the mountain you don't descend to the valley, what kind of warfare is this, right? These guys were both, as we've seen, they could dismount or mount depending on the situation. And in general, there is always some kind of ground where to fight, especially if there is any strategic relevance to it. That's where the more fertile land is, where more people live. That's where you want to establish the seigneury. You go out there in open field and you crash. Of course, again, in the north it's more difficult to do so because, as we've seen, there are less resources, cavalry does cost. That's mostly the reason. It's a systemic factor. It's not that, I don't know, you meet more flat land, right? There are people who believe that for some reason, again, that the orographic characteristic dictates what kind of tactics you're using. That has absolutely nothing to do with the strategic essence of any army that at the end of the day would have also fought pretty much in the same way. So it is a bit too much sort of mechanistic, deterministic, and fundamentally rigged systems of interpretation. The need for knights became urgent, if anything, mostly because of the larger enemies that they had to confront in these more advanced places. And again, the northern Iberian Christian forces had already gained the upper hand somehow, and they were developing their own heavy cavalry in parallel. Surprise, surprise, by the way, Spanish Islam from the mid-8th century, so basically a generation or two, they had arrived in Iberia, had increasingly relied on cavalry. Who knows why? Well, obviously because they were adapting to Iberian warfare that already had a lot of that, as we've seen in the Iberian Visigothic times. Also, the Romans extracted fair cavalry from the Iberian Peninsula during their long domination. Hence, we're looking also at armies, Christian or Muslim alike, in the Iberian Peninsula that, in fact, are very difficult to distinguish, right? This should always be the case. Warfare creates hybrids, right? It can destroy cultures, but also really making them look even more similar. So by the early 11th century in Christian Spain, as in much of continental Europe, so more or less along in the same line of the other Western European countries, the term miles had evolved from meaning soldier to specifically signifying knight, right? The big change in post-Carolingian Europe, it's also in some bits of Spain, had just proceeded out of the Carolingian system, right? The 10th century in particular is the moment in which, whether you are a Western Frank, an Eastern Frank, an Italic, if you can fight on horseback, essentially as an affluent aristocrat that can train himself lifelong, participating with other knights in retinues, war bands, in warfare, you are essentially the same thing. You're a literal military class that basically becomes the knightly aristocracy that we understand, especially in a widespread level across this entire world that becomes quite interconnected also by the interrecognition even across different countries of this status, right? In the later centuries, if anything, also the same knights will become In fact, the term knight itself will become, let's say, the hallmark of some higher nobility and possible to some heavier type of fighter, where the miles was sort of like the vanilla kind of basic heavy cavalry fighter, professional fighter, right? So separated in all of this from the wide majority of the masses that can be at some point also pretty good infantrymen, but they are going to be increasingly subordinated to this elite. So infantry had obviously not vanished in Spain, and it wouldn't, as we explained before with the Spanish villas. The quintessential warrior, however, also in the Iberian Peninsula, was now envisioned exclusively on horseback. Again, it's likely that even from an archetypal point of view, nothing had really ever changed. We see in the Iberian sources a great deal, for example, of also Islamic art influence. And so iconographically speaking, we often see lighter types of horsemen that were sort of more typical of the Islamic side. People with sort of, more primitive forms of stirrup, fewer armor, more sort of overarm grip. Even though, again, the lance, the spear were wielded all the most creative ways by every horseman involved here. Again, some of this iconographic conventions really speak of different military techniques that definitely set apart the Christian world in the north from the Islamic one in the south in some broader sense, even though in between a lot of similar and undistinguishable things, in fact, occurred. Also, given the fact that the northern Iberian north had not properly been feudalized along at least the patterns of the post-Carolingian world in particularly direct ways, and or it had spread, for example, in societies like the one of the Catalan cities that were historically a bit more, let's say, egalitarian, even though a chivalric culture was fundamentally spread there, similarly to other feudal countries later on. The social standing of these Christian northern Iberian fighters was diverse. Initially, there was the cavalry of private militias or bodyguards, a development of the Gothic comitatus, right? All those, it's a bit like the senior with the masnata, the huscarls following the hird, properly following the leader, all right, the warlord. It's such socially and culturally primitive and simple system that it had always worked also in the sort of darkest of the early Middle Ages. It had really been working everywhere. This is we have described in the videos about Romano-Germanic warfare. We'll surely come back on the comitatus. If anything, I made a video properly explaining what that was, especially in the Germanic world, even though the terminology stemmed from Latin, witnessing to also the Romanization of Germanic warfare, even before the migration era, due to the heavy fighting of the Germans in, other than just against the Roman army in the previous centuries. By the early 11th century, and likely earlier, the militia palazzi, so the palatine, in this case, mostly militas, we're talking knights, right, of the Asturian-Leonese kings, in fact, consisted of a knightly corps. And this is also kind of obvious. And again, it looks pretty much like I've seen in other places. What is interesting here, for example, I don't know, as the Anglo-Danish at this point, for example, were more infantry-based at large because there wasn't much social certification. And generally speaking, Northern Europe has less resources, etc. There would be a preference for infantry warfare. It wasn't an enormous cavalry development, as you know, or even a particularly bulky one in a broader tactical sense in Britain. Even though, if you look at the Celtic fringe, there was some sort of greater amount of horsemen, but lighter ones. Similarly, in the northern Iberian world, you have a system declined on the basis of that political and social system. A more tendentially feudalized system, because also important Frankish influence, but some, again, lighter bias, necessity for especially these heavy and long raids up to Al-Andalus, in the service especially also of Islamic forces of the northern Iberia as mercenaries on a regular basis. This is actually the biggest factor, the elephant in the room here, that increases at some point from an operational point of view. But let's not really think that cavalry simply moves faster, right? On the longer run, cavalry and infantry basically proceed at the same level, so they would always fight combined. So the notion that you need more cavalry just to make raids up to Cordoba, it's not really, because, I don't know, in the morning in northern Spain you say hi to your wife, you ride all the day, you arrive to the Gibraltar Strait in the evening. Actually, at midday you come back home by the evening. Things were much more complex. But again, there was this greater hit-and-run tactics combination that was producing, in fact, a larger amount of lighter cavalrymen of some sort. Again, mostly due to societal proportions rather than some sort of mechanistic or technicistic explanation about the theater or the type of fighting or any kind of external influence. Alongside these troops, who were, as we've seen, essentially masnad of some sort, and could come also from relatively undignified social background, so literally serfs that had, distinguished themselves in the service of their master, maybe starting as infantrymen, again receiving some land, some means of sustainment, leaving often actually with the master, and so becoming familiar to one side. So it's all something we know, in fact, through different terminologies, such as saying familia, all right? But next to these guys, there was a very important social element that were the infanzones, all right? The infanzones, the term comes from infants in Latin, so it's like in French, enfant, right? And it expresses this more strictly genetic sense of filiation. In fact, who were the infanzones, who gained prestige and livelihood through private service as well, through their system of clienteles, and in part intertwined, as we've seen, with the also with the retinues of the kings to some degree. Well, the etymology stems from again the relation of affiliation with the ancient Gothic nobility of blood, right, or some broader nobility of, because again also the north had been partly Germanized. Let's not forget about this. The infanzones would have been the descendants of the primatus, right? So the first of the Gothic establishment, distinguished by privileged legal status before the Islamic invasion. So again, today we'll not really enter the full depths of this topic because it can be profitably rounded up a little bit on the basis also of some broader historiographical understanding, just historical contextualization. But let's put in this way, this status, understood again from nobility of blood, from this ancestral past of sort, where there was indeed some continuity, if anything also in terms of wealth, right? Given that, as we'll see now, these infanzones were knights like all the others. In fact, the status endured among them. The infanzones also received stipendia or benefices from the kings of Leon or counts of Castile. I also made different videos for all these chunks because, as you know, there is the kingdom of the Asturias, and then this also comes to encompass Leon. There are lots of dynastic ties, clashes of all kind carried out by, in fact, men protected by these men or served by these men. So you have Castile at some point emerging as a county, but eventually surpassing also Leon in importance, so much so that the kingdom will be of Castile and Leon later, right? So the infanzones gradually, some of them would have also survived in different ways in areas at some point dominated by the Muslims, right? They would have gradually entered into these kings' vassalage, right? So one thing, this is more like a personal connection than any social one, right? You can't be a king bodyguard as an infanzone, for example, right? It can't happen. It's a matter of clientele. Very often the noble youth was sent again to learn the craft of war in service of these men. It was an incredibly brutal yet effective training, and this is how these men were also psychophysically selected. Like, they were really tough, and as we've seen, perpetually engaged in warfare, basically. It was just a broader raison d'etre, right? You fight as you breathe. You search. You're in search of wealth. You serve for some Islamic powers that are abundantly fighting also against one another. El Cid is an example of this. El Cid was friend with many Muslims under whom he fought at some point, of course, without infringing upon the broader Christian, say, faith and in alignment with Christian powers. But at some point, like, also antagonizing and showing, of course, that these men could come in the service of the Cordobans in the south. And again, raids launched all across the peninsula were to become a more generalized thing historically, right? I made multiple videos on this topic, also how by the 11th century there was a trade shift with all these tributes, right? Raids turned into threat of raids, as it was enough deterrent force to just exact tributes from the Muslim powers in the south that gradually weakened themselves in the process and eventually were taken over at some point, even without a fight there was a lot of fight in between, but they subjected themselves properly as subjects of the Christian rulers. That's why the Reconquista literally ends in 1212, not in 1492, because after Las Navas, every Muslim power in the peninsula, namely, subjects himself as a client state, as a vassal, one to whichever Christian power in that case would have, as they had all participated in Las Navas as well, and each monarchy had its sector, like a longitudinally speaking. The infanzones retained military roles that during the Gothic monarchy had exempted the primates from corporal punishment and servitude because they were noblemen, and they thus incarnated the traditional elite in a broader metaphysical and spiritual sense, right? There was really a nobility of blood. There was a genetic constituent to that. By the late 10th century, the term miles definitely applied to the infanzones, because at that point, given that the broader knightly combat was generalizing among the elite, the infanzones, being the elite, de facto fought in that more recognizably knightly fashion that, say, we distinguish from the previous knights of the migration here. They were knights in the same way. I mean, some of the Goths that settled in Spain would have been really something to behold, like very much Allanized, covered in iron scales, etc. So literally the knight as we intended. But of course, also readapting a bit to the Roman society, to the Hispano-Roman society, and if anything, only from this recovery, especially the late from the age of the second invasions, and in this case also from probably the Arab conquest in the previous centuries at large, from the late 10th century to a more straightforwardly knightly, ever heavier, and sort of tendentially stepping up properly as a different kind of warrior along some kind of feudal pattern. In a society profoundly shaped by military demands, it was inevitable that the title miles would eclipse other distinctions. Because again, what mattered is whether you were capable of fighting on horseback, gradually and becoming ever more collectively integrated in mounted shock combat, knowing how to wield a sword, from horseback, and especially being willing to engage, to existentially engage in this relentless military lifestyle, also in times of peace, and often fighting also against other Christians for that matter, but surely being galvanized by holy war ideals and all the sort of the riches of Al-Andalus opening in front of your riding the tree. And so you can argue that the broader spectrum of social differences was sort of coagulatingly categorizing. There was just an elite at the top, and the rest of the system was mostly infantrymen, or at least lighter type of cavalrymen. Of course, like in other places, beneath the surface, distinctions lingered. Right? At some point, we will explain how every country in Europe had some particularity in their knighthood. Right? The Germans had their servant ones, the Italians were the fully urbanized one, the French had things like the liege homage. There is some important political and social implication to this, eventually transmuting itself in a cultural and anthropological one, except basically Western knights looked and fought very much the same. It was definitely a tendency towards homogenization. The Iberian Peninsula, however, maintains this greater spectrum of also tactical differences, as we were explaining before, with lighter elements that you otherwise don't see, or at least in such a large, normal fashion in the rest of Western Europe. So we also have to clarify a bit what societal differences existed behind them. In today's video, I will do as much as possible, but it's a topic we just browse for the first time today, or at least we are discussing more technical terms that need to be widened in other videos. A notary from the late 11th century acknowledged this complexity when defining infanzones as, quote, milites non infimis parentibus ortus sent nobiles genere nec non et potestate qui vulgare lingua infanzones dicuntur. Right? So he's basically noting the existence of milites of lowly origins, right? Milites ignobiles genere and so on. That reveals next to these noblemen, there were, of course, individuals of lower birth that were becoming milites. And in the 11th century, this was somehow normal also in other parts of Europe. But in Spain, this seems to have been more pronounced. Also because miles could be a specific in a way, but also relatively ambiguous term, especially depending on what kind of national standards you were taking. If, as a Spaniard, you were sort of more inclined to see, a miles in more light fashion, of course, your idea of it would have maybe changed slightly compared now to a northern French one. It is not to say, by the way, that they weren't ultra-heavy milites. We see very interesting things. For example, from an iconographic point of view, and again, check out, for example, the video made on Navarrese, Aragonese, and Catalan warfare. There was really a lot there because that was the more Frankish influence part, right? But there are very interesting episodes, of course, heavier, sometimes even heavier than normal arms and armor, at least, however, exceptionally wielded. But as we were saying before, in Spain, and not to be found elsewhere, that, however, fell out of use and may have also been the product of in fact, more heterogeneous development of arms and armor in Spain, depending on different regions that were sort of, because again, the system was so big that we say Spain, yeah, but it's just something much more complex than that, and often also culturally divided. In any case, what the aforementioned notary was saying is that one could become a miles from various social strata, but in an era of relentless warfare, being a miles became the paramount distinction. In terms of actual lifestyle, one key difference, among others, between social groups beyond legal status was that infanzones owned their weapons and horses. whereas the milites in private retinues were kept by their lords. Right? This is typical of many other contexts. We've seen it also for the Familia Regis of Henry I of England, and we're basically almost there also, chronologically speaking. There were some very well-established noble families that normally provided even their cadets with conspicuous, resources like, again, splendid war horses, great panoplies. But there were also people who had sort of a more ambiguous origin that were, however, pretty darn good fighters, and they managed to climb the social ladder by being rewarded by their lords that counted on their fidelity more, given that they depended more on them socially to elevate themselves, as they actually weren't recognized as noblemen of blood. Naturally, also the distinction of who was, for example, an infanzone or not is complicated. It's more complicated than it seems, but at large, all right. If anything, it is for us to specifically and precisely decipher in case to case and how it had come to be in this very variegated land, but still, right, it made sense overall. And it speaks, as I was saying before, of that general difference that had existed in Visigothic Spain between the elite and the rest, right, in ways that were more similar to the Frankish world than, the Anglo-Saxon or the Longobarд one. Now, in Spain, it is challenging to conceive of groups more socially or legally distinct from the infanzones than those described in sources as clientes, homines, mercenari, vassalli, or satellites. By the way, this fits beautifully with what we were discussing the other day about the general concept of feudalism, the vassalatic beneficiary system, however you want to call it, that obviously is some kind of approximation, because indeed there are all these kind of shades here, and they don't necessarily fit even obviously a juridical vocabulary. Sometimes in the sources you find them described in different ways. Cliens stands for a client, broadly meant. Homo is literally a freeman intended. Mercenarius is a guy who fights for money. Vassallus entails some kind of vassalatic beneficiary connection. Satellites has to do with some broader ally, people who gravitate literally around you. Even auxiliaries, it really depends, but you have to understand from case to case what kind of relation exists. Naturally, it's a relation of dependency. As I was saying in the aforementioned video, feudalism is, as a broader terminological approximation, an okay term if you want to describe such complex reality, because at the end of the day, this was a clientary society. You can call it however you like. You can't erase the fact that there were powerful men who hired others in a way or another for war and rewarded them in order to strengthen their own political and territorial stand in the process. And that's how literally these powers are built. Especially, again, the Spanish interland, places like Castilla, Aragon were very, very, very feudal. Navarre, later Portugal, Leon, etc. So they had always more or less, they had emerged like that. Naturally, the southernmost you go also in literally in these forming countries that are expanding towards the south. The least feudal the outlook really is. At some point, there are crusaders, people from England, from Scandinavia, from France, etc., that settled, especially when they were moving to the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. As you know, Lisbon was recovered during the Second Crusade, this expedition of northern Europeans that helped the Portuguese to recover that from the Muslims. But obviously there, as we were hinting at before, the society was not feudal, right? Also, the Muslim had something very similar. And again, the northern you go, the more these Islamic powers look like. And they are, again, Spaniards themselves. There isn't a radical ethnic divide. Doesn't matter how complex the picture is. Still, from an ethnical, cultural point of view, but at large, we're talking the same people, right? They look very similar, also militarily speaking. warfare and the martial lifestyle drew all these forces together. So the miles is the most straightforward way of recognizing a guy who fights, at least in that technically heavier kind, and is recognized as this person of interest. Like, even if you have seen this homines, this satellites, as some sort of relatively unspecified, unspecifically provided individuals in terms of social status, obviously we're talking to people of some importance, right? They weren't the average guy who fought just as a skirmisher, right? They were individuals at the heads of military retinues, at least, right? And eventually tied to the local establishment. Aristocrats, most of the times themselves, were not properly noblemen. This establishment compacted. Warfare was the glue, right, that kept all these individuals together, encouraging close interaction and fostering a collective spirit that laid the foundation also for an ethic that would soon manifest explicitly, the way to chivalry, that is also influenced, for example, by the Arab version of it to some degree, but is otherwise straightforwardly universal. These were old militas. They had their raison d'etre in this incredibly effective military performance that was really ramping up especially the power of cavalry shock charges in a never more collectively trained fashion. The demands of an increasingly intense and mounted form of warfare required more knights than those supplied by the public duties of the infanzones and private retinues as well. Sometimes, again, also of the lighter kind, for societal reasons. More men, if anything. Not everybody could be a nobleman, and you needed your retinues, of course, to be composed by people who were not militas, technically speaking. Nevertheless, there was a more subtle division, which led to the creation of Asturian-Leonese, Spain's most unique military institution, the caballeria villana. These were essentially small landowners and free emphyteutic tenants in the Duero Valley, depopulated since the end of the Visigothic period and repopulated with the onset of the Reconquista, an institution intended to augment existing militia forms, right? I forgot to discuss, for example, that video about feudalism of kings and generals, the emphyteutic relations that existed from a quite long time, in fact, from the late antiquity, especially in the Mediterranean. The caballeria villana's distinctiveness arose from its general necessity, the fact that the momentum of the Reconquista had to be maintained, also co-opting people living places that had been just reconquered, and or that had traditionally not been militarized. Picture the struggle of 10th century Christian Spain with its small northern kingdoms peering from the mountains onto the vast meseta fields. Confronting them was a peasant pastoral population compelled to remain ever armed themselves because they were basically paranoid, right? I mean, they had become so considering they lived literally on the frontier with the Christians and the Muslims. They were something themselves regarding to that, but as non-fighters, generally speaking, men could at most defend their farms, right? And always at risk of seeing their entire harvest wiped out by these perennial raids, etc. Facing, again, formidable foes. And so it's tempting, with the benefit of hindsight and centuries of documented history, to label for example, also in this broader Christian momentum, the Muslims, a colossus with the feet of clay. In reality, conquering the windswept Moorish cavalry-dominated plateau was arduous, and maintaining control was even more challenging. what you witness in the fall of Muslim Spain is not something that would have simply happened by itself. It happened under the push of the Western civilization, the Frankish world, the northern Iberian Christian forces, out of their will to power. This is true for the Crusades. This is true for the Italian maritime republics sweeping the Mediterranean from the Muslims. This is true for the Crusades in the Baltic, led by the Germans and the Scandinavians. This is true in general for the conquest of Constantinople in 1204 by the Latins. This is not some random, the Moors had to fall in some way. No. The Christians fought their way through, and in one of the most shockingly brutal fashion in the entire medieval history. Stemming in part also from the rough primitivity and brutality of the northern peoples and this newly co-opted forces that had much, for example, to in terms of vendetta and a general resentment also towards this or that lord, and especially the Muslims at some point, given that the northern the more Christians you found historically. And so in general, it's not like at some point there was a memory eraser, even if we're talking multiple centuries after the Islamic conquest. The memory, the fact that there had been a past where these guys had arrived and had come to dictate rule, was pretty much still there. Naturally, everything was politicized in ways that are enormously more complex and complicated depending on say, the local areas. This is obvious that the various communities had very different and multi-layered allegiances to this and that. As we've seen, we find Islamic troops who are actually quite faithful in fighting for their Christian masters. A bit the opposite is true from the other side, exactly because the Christians were actually gaining the upper hand as a whole, but there were instances of, again, this very different kind of communities aligning in the most disparate fashion. From its outset, the Reconquista relied on two foundations: the castle, because also the Iberian Peninsula naturally underwent a severe encastellation, especially from the Christian side, and all its Frankish feudal influence. But it had been happening in the Islamic world, given that the Caliphate of Cordoba had fallen. They had disbanded it itself because they realized that there was not a caliphal standard anymore, as it mostly relied in Spain on the universality of the dominion within the Iberian Peninsula. It was sort of considered like a cosmos on its own, and it was not really just like a strange idea. As, in fact, the same Muslim lands were collapsing in public authority, especially in the 11th century. They were feudalizing, privatizing. And so the entire basis of that more centralized system that the Muslims had established, that was already rigged a little bit compared, to the Roman Empire, right? Was at this point melting away under the relentless struggle of the Christians that had been building up this feudal system in all its military potential from a much more pressured background, right? The castle was so important that the most important part of Spain, Castile, as an entire region, would derive its name, an heraldic symbol, from the proliferation of castles on its soil. In fact, Castile is the most feudal country of all, and at least the most successful along that pattern. The other element is the cavalry. On average, in Spain, more agile and lightly equipped than its contemporary Frankish equivalent, armed and mounted sometimes in the very Moorish style for communication and swift movement in a vastly populated and arid operational zone. Think about this, the lack of water, for example. Like heavy cavalry needs more water in general. It makes a greater logistical effort, and lighter cavalrymen are more sustainable in certain terrains. in that sense. So it's mostly a matter of power dynamics, not much of the environment per se, but the communities are informed by that. That's yet another factor you can sort of pick for explaining the fighting a la Jineta. Securing knights tied to the land they defended was crucial. Hence, the vassalic beneficiary system was definitely not an invention or some strange imaginary system where everything was about the elite and its military function. I mean, gold, look, you can't, of course, so it's easy to make the point, but medieval Spain, what the system really was, and again, there were cities, everything was complex. The beneficium was indeed, in the same Spain, more impractical at some point for funding, for example, heavier cavalry, due to the mesetas' low fertility. Not much just for aridity, but again, for the collapse of the ancient sort of agricultural infrastructure. The fact is, we explained that this would become like a no man's land for centuries of hit and run, raiding warfare so much that most of this land eventually is turning to cattle breeding and producing, at the end of the Middle Ages, in fact, by far the largest woolen production by scale in Europe. Then you had southern Italy, then England in proportion, right? But the Mesta system, in especially in Castile, was something enormous, literally enormous. Another problem for stabilizing a heavier cavalry force was the same Reconquista's fluid front, constantly reshaped by the frequent advances and retreats of both sides. So while, indeed, private forces sold their service to the same Muslims to eventually reach the bowels of their power and looting as far as Andalusia, from a northern Iberian Christian king, it was a bit sort of difficult to demand some prolonged military service, to impose it on the various vassals, the infanzones, nobility, establishment, etc. This was really typical across all of Europe, that there were normally, because of this, the fruit of generations of negotiation over military service with the higher authority, like very few tens of days of service warranted by sort of feudal custom, right? So in Iberia, as we've seen, there is even a less homogeneous system. Besides, there was a constant warfare between Christians already. The Counts of Castile, forced to wage on 3 fronts against Muslims and the Christian kings of Leon and Navarre, they were also basically, from the Christian side, married with one another, and trying always to capture through this dynastic inheritances and due to also to speed it up by killing, etc., each other's possessions, and at some point creating this weird, as also historically significant, of course, developments, such as, again, the County of Castile emerging as the greater power among what had been previously bigger ones, developed this new cavalry type that was somehow lighter in kind. In the third quarter of the 10th century, right around there, at least we can sort of document the mechanism more clearly. And it was fundamentally a social one. The caballeria villana relied on tax exemptions granted to peasants who agreed to acquire and maintain weapons and horses at their own expense and reserve as knights in battle. Some of them, of course, were fully fledged milites, heavy cavalry, right? Horses, though costly, were relatively common in Spain at the time. As we've seen, this was a country that had always relied on some kind of mounted combat. However, a bit lighter stuff was thus preferred, not just in mounts. In fact, also weapons, while expensive, were lighter than those used beyond the Pyrenees. This facilitated at least some larger forces to be fielded, however, with some lighter bias that, again, you don't quite see in the West. In the West, the pattern, again, countries like, England, France, Italy, the Rhineland, etc. It's just like there is a bulk of heavy cavalry and heavy infantry, and then, yes, there are lighter fighters, but they're either crossbowmen, very specialized troops, including horse archers, telling the truth, mounted crossbowmen, especially as you go on in the 12th century, that were actually way more common than we think in the West. But they were cultivated in more specialistic ways and in contained numbers as a consequence by the Westerners, and wouldn't have sort of a broader, well, in the later Middle Ages, yes, because there is a diversification of, especially with the hemming of the ranks and the necessity of supporting it with ever more auxiliary horsemen, right, in its effort. But again, what you see in Spain is really different. In Spain, you really have a consistent amount of lighter cavalrymen that could be, by the way, some heavy as well, like not necessarily just skirmishers, but surely capable of fighting a la Uneta. After all, if you look at these times, say here we are at the end of the 10th century, I don't know, by the Battle of Hastings, in the Bayeux Tapestry, you still see basically at the turn of the 11th to 12th century, I don't know, the Norman knights, the heavy kind that still sort of threw their spears against the Anglo-Danish shield wall. So this is somehow normal, but again, the lighter bias remains. And of course, the later Middle Ages provide also us with an overwhelming evidence of this. I never made a video about the Unetas, but we'll surely do it at some point. The Caballero Villano thus shouldered a significant financial burden to achieve this status, per se. They were sometimes even regular farmers. But given the generally militarized picture, and so the incredible brutality they normally found themselves in, the fact that there were a bit of cattle breeders and raiders as a consequence, so Spain was literally a bit of a far west, right? All these men were versed in throat cutting of some sort. They had witnessed raids in their life. So the general proclivity to leave into that and the security, prestige, and social mobility that becoming a Caballero Villano entailed justified the military cost and the general risk, right, of this existence. And so there is some sort of gentry that emerges in the process that, again, it's nothing impressive in broader technical terms, but it's still effective and stiffening the Christian forces. Naturally, again, from if we were to see this from the Islamic side, there was something extremely similar happening, and more or less throughout the same dynamics, except the Muslims at large had less heavy cavalry in general than the Northerners. Right, the more time passes, and the more the Christians in Spain become similar to, say, again, abandon this lighter bias in general. You really have, however, to literally arrive to the Renaissance for that, where also just general warfare was changing in much deeper ways. The status of Caballero Villano conferred by Castilian rulers effectively aligned it with the infanzones class, setting the stage for the latter emergence of the same as a distinction, meaning that the same infanzones were, as we've seen, militas. They were heavy cavalry. They were the nobility. They were rich, but again, we're still talking 10th century northern Iberia. Like, the difference was not overwhelming, for which, again, some Caballero Villano could not at some point become as powerful as effective throughout a lifetime of warfare if he was lucky to survive and gain enough power. Again, the surplus was miserable in perspective, but in order to rise the social ladder and to actually establish yourself as a lord and part of a broader military class privilege separate from the rest of the people, well, that was a very viable option for it. Though the caballeria villana as a whole never collectively elevated, because it was always considered of lower rank, hence the distinction from the infanzones, it established the conditions for bolstering noble cavalry ranks with contributions from the lower rural strata. So who succeeded at least in getting so powerful, a few namely of course, but could and would provide with that establishment material that the Christian rulers really needed in order to secure at some point the ever larger amount of land they were able to recover from the Muslims. The fact that they had shed blood in the same way, even if, less noble blood, right, compared to the infanzones, sort of had elevated them, sort of provided them with a chance. Like, again, Western history is replete with examples of an enlightened elite that allows the underdogs, so to say, to prove themselves and giving them a chance to ameliorate themselves and conquering the world in the process, like, the Romans, Napoleon, etc. So there is an important level of military force unlocked here through the caballeros villanos. The rising prominence of mounted combat and the corresponding decline in infantry combat, at least for the moment, because we will see again that the more cities were conquered, the more urban militias were in fact equipped with significant infantry forces, led to another significant development. Right at this point, we are in the depths of the higher Middle Ages, and in general, again, Spain does have some important level of urbanization in different areas, but we're talking an overwhelmingly agricultural and especially from the Christian side, an increasingly feudal system, right? And the significant development stemming from the rising prominence of mounted combat was that those serving as cavalry began receiving compensation, regardless of who they were, while those who would have served as infantry were partially exempted from military duties as well. This obviously reflected the broader mechanism that had already taken place in other countries where, in fact, most people had ended up under some general lord that they worked for and that received protection from. In Spain, you can argue that some parts of the north had been so primitive that it was almost like still a tribal mentality of sort. Naturally, we're exaggerating, but still clinically wise, it was not that different. It was a world at times even similar to the Celtic fringe, as it was Celtic fringe, telling the truth, in other parts of Atlantic Europe. Naturally, again, since it was in Southern Europe, it was a bit more civilized in the moment in perspective, but not that much, right? So you can argue that in these areas, the idea that society develops to the point that there are people who can afford not to go to war on a regular basis, just paying some of their work to have a much more efficient mounted elite to take care of the work, is there, right? At least they would still be involved in warfare, but as militia, not as professionals. And this makes a bit all the difference. The heavy losses of men and horses in campaigns known as ataifas necessitated such measures. Death in battle drove social mobility within the militas class as well, because people died, and so you had to replace them. And as we've seen also, the north was not particularly populated. People were a bit more proclivious to violence, and so it was easier with this lack of social certification to find new caballeros villanos to become more sort of heavier troops, like nobiliar forces, if they made it to the sky, so to say. The problem of the high costs of horse and their maintenance is key to this, because other societies would also develop a particular system of compensation for that loss, and that mostly was at the benefit of the elite, right? It also generated many scams. Still, if we look at the 10th century, we're not definitely looking at particularly advanced places. I mean, there wasn't this overwhelming monetary economy or whatever, but still, it was important to determine whose horse that was in combat. There were some sort of lists in the units that were maintained. Again, we know this also from better documented cases in different areas, in other times and places. However, again, it doesn't matter how also lighter cavalry could be in Spain. Still, it was cavalry. Cavalry does cost, right? It's really technically very demanding. And so this high cost of horses and the maintenance, coupled with the example of a Spanish Islam paying its knights, because as we've seen, it was a more advanced system. It had sort of a fiscal mechanism. It had more concentrated power. It had sort of bulk of salaried troops that could be used on a wider theater, were noted and adopted in Christian regions. Right, the idea of creating properly a salaried cavalry, as we were saying before, for the same infanzones, even when they were just by lifestyle fighters, was sometimes the only way, as it would happen also in the rest of Europe, to convince these guys to fight for a specific leader. They naturally had already to be rich and provided with retinues, and so not just means of compensation, but means of deterrence. All right. You can't understand how in depth this mechanism worked if you don't realize how much Christians also fought against one another, and in which circumstances. The infanzones were compensated according to their military contributions, often through stipendiatas in land or coin, because when we talk about stipendia, and again, what were these beneficia actually? They increasingly served as vassals of magnates. In any case, the land, as we explained, was just the obvious base of the system. And this definitely signaled a gradual feudalization of the Asturian-Leonese militia. Meanwhile, the obligation to respond to the fonsado, the general military levy, increasingly became, for those unable to equip themselves as knights, a substitute tax, the fossataria, which freed them from armed service. Right. This again highlights how there is probably a social stratification where those who fight ever better because they're properly supported by a greater amount of people that are not at least capable of fighting so well, and that mostly work for them, especially to keep away the raiders, to again be de facto under their lordship, right? So the two things are not separated at all, right? And so you can argue that regardless of the differences that we listed a bit, as it was occurring elsewhere at the time, Spain's legal class of free individuals divided into a group of warriors and a larger class of non-combatants who labored and paid taxes. And this would, on the long run, of course, also smoothen this broader, also ideal sense of freedom, because, again, how do you maintain freedom exactly in, I don't know, the 10th century, right? Especially in northern Spain, like how do you... who's there to protect your rights? I mean, yes, as part of a community, you will basically have that. But in general, what kind of meaning, right, will this freedom have? In fact, if you can't even provide for your own individual defense, especially against this horsemen, and let's be clear here, like it's not like infantry is weak, right? Infantry will maintain a very important capacity against its, especially also in the Iberian Peninsula, in some areas at least, in particular, against cavalry, the lighter type, as you understand. These men, in part, had already been selected through, they had been defending their own communities from those Islamic raiders that habitually came to play. And again, they were pretty much utter Spaniards. And at the lower level, everything became ever less distinguishable, as we have explained today. We'll explain better also in other videos. But if we were to mark, let's say, a moment where things start stepping up essentially in a feudal knightly direction in Spain, this is at least one of the most important steps. Not that, again, in Gothic times there wasn't already something of that kind. Not that, again, Spain will fully, again, adhere to Western standards or reach them in degree. And as we've seen, there are different motivations, there are different social premises, so different political international mechanisms. However, this is the also relative obvious base that the West especially develops in terms of knightly force, and in ways that are going to be pretty effective in that specific Iberian theater against the Muslims that will not be able to deploy something as effective as this. Yes, it would take forever before, again, breaking through and so on. Las Navas is 300 years away, just as essentially the Islamic invasion had been 300 years away. So we're talking 600 years, of really hard sort of 500 years, let's say, 200 years away in this case, but really a very long time, half of a millennium, that therefore you must take in consideration in some meaningful and serious fashion when considering such development. All right. So, what to say? Indeed, when you study medieval warfare, you have to be pretty aware of all these differences. You have to look at the various theaters comparatively. Otherwise, it doesn't sort of make much sense to approach the complexity of the war. Right? There is no way to actually learn of this. And so this is it. Again, it's it takes time to get exactly from century how the system worked. And this is what I'm trying to do for the entire medieval European warfare, hopefully extending this to lots of other times and in regions. Nevertheless, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.